Chapter 5 Campfire Tales. Jack woke up first out of the group and wasn't at all surprised when he saw that it was only 4:30 in the morning. He wondered if maybe he should shake one of the other two. They had agreed on an early start after all, but 4:30 was horrendously early, even for a journey of this sort. So Jack laid back down on his patch of lounge floor that he had found himself the night before and stared at the ceiling above him. It wasn't hard for him to stay awake. All he could think about what was going to happen that day. They now had somewhat of a plan, and better yet, they had maps. Even if it was one of the dirtiest bits of paper and was very roughly drawn by freehand, there was still no denying it. In Jack's eyes, this plan was unstoppable. Once they got past the obstacle that was Mrs. Thorland, that is. After another half an hour or so, Emma started to rustle and make a bit of noise, just as Jack had thought she would. She sat up, and the two of them met each other's eyes. "Morning," she said in an audible whisper. "How long have you been awake?" "Not too long," said Jack, now starting to sit up himself. "Only about half an hour. It's nearly 5. "Yeah, I think I'll start getting ready now," said Emma, and she threw her blanket off herself and headed towards the bathroom. Before Jack had any time to think about waking Jacob up, Emma came tiptoeing back into the living room, placed a hand over Jacob's mouth, and slapped him across the face. Since she was covering his mouth, all that came out of him were muffled yells and screams. When he became aware of what had just happened, he started to calm down and relax. "Out of all the methods you could have used to wake me up," said Jacob in an aggressive whisper, rubbing the left side of his face. "Oh, shush," said Emma, tying her laces on her leather boots. "Start getting ready, will you? Start rounding up those books we're bringing. And don't forget to get yourself a weapon, too." "Oh, yes, of course. I always love taking orders from other people in my own house," said Jacob, slowly rising off the couch he slept on. "Like I'd forget a weapon," he said to Jack under his breath so Emma couldn't hear him. 10 minutes of everyone moving around, and soon they would be ready to start. Except there was a sound of soft but heavy footsteps. Mrs. Thorland had woken up and heard the group making noises. Jack, Emma, and even Jacob had froze with fear this time. It was obvious that from the look on their faces they had not expected this to happen at all. Mrs. Thorland's eyes found their luggage, and she looked livid. It was lucky that Jacob had already packed the books that they took from the library. "Well, well," she said, not bothering to keep quiet, and a husk in her voice had made itself known again. "What's all this, then? Going on a little excursion, are we? And if so, why the need to take off at such an early hour? You were here all evening yesterday. Why not say something then, rather than vanishing so early in the morning? Well, go on, explain." There was an uncomfortable silence any of them had ever been in. In Jack's brain was racing to try and think of a story that was both believable and was worth explaining to Mrs. Thorland. Normally at a time like this, Emma would step forward and give some reason for what they were doing, which was usually made everyone even more uncomfortable. However, for the first time in her life, Emma failed to come through with a brave attitude and ridiculous story. The silence was dragging on now. Mrs. Thorland started tapping her foot impatiently. Surprisingly enough, it was Jack who actually broke the silence. "Mrs. Thorland," he said, quivering slightly. "It's not as bad as it seems." "Oh, really?" she asked loudly. "I would really love to hear this," her foot still tapping on the solid wood. "We were going to—" Jack started to say until Emma found her voice again. "We were only going to visit my family in Fronston," she said firmly. Mrs. Thorland's eyebrows rose so far up her forehead that they almost vanished into her hair. "It takes around 4 days to get there, and that's going through the forest. So that's why we wanted to leave so early, you see, to get the trip over with as soon as possible." The more Emma went on explaining her story, the eyebrows on Mrs. Thorland's face steadily began to drop lower and lower to the point where they were a normal place where eyebrows should be. She looked backwards and forwards between the three of them and finally spoke again. "Jacob, have you got enough blankets, dear?" Amazingly, her tone was warm and comforting, to the point where she caught her son off guard. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we have enough," he began, pulling out the blankets he had squashed into his one bag, showing his mother how prepared they were. "Come on, Jacob, you'll need more than just one for each of you," Mrs. Thorland stood up off the chair she had occupied just a few minutes ago, opened a cupboard, and pulled out 3 more blankets. From the look on Jack's face, he hadn't even noticed there was a cupboard there. He bent down to pick up one of the blankets and started packing it into his small bag. It was rather dusty, and there were a few holes where moths had eaten away at it, but nevertheless, it was still very kind of her to loan them some covers. "Oh, wow, Ma. Thanks a lot," said Jacob, reaching out to put one arm around her and give her a tight squeeze before letting go again. It was hard for Jacob not to make the departure seem like a big thing, seeing as how they were only supposed to be going to Fronston. After a few more heartfelt goodbyes and double-checking all of their gear, Jacob opened the front door and the 3 of them made their way out into the world. This was it. Jack and his 2 companions were finally on their way. Every step they took brought them one step closer to Eurythemus's secret and the black hole itself. The sun was rising now over Jack's favorite spot upon the hill across the river, and right now it looked incredibly inviting, but he walked straight past it until all 3 of them encountered the same problem. How foolish they were to not think of this immediately. They had to cross the river that divided the 2 halves of Wrangleton. "Oh yeah," said Jacob blankly, staring at the flowing water. "I forgot about this." Which is odd, because you think we'd remember something like this. "Can we not go around?" asked Jack, looking to the east side of the river. "I know the river's not so deep further down that way, but it is quite far down. Could possibly add another day to our trip," said Jacob, now looking in the same direction as Jack was. "No way," said Emma, almost at the exact same time Jacob had stopped speaking. "I'm not wasting another day just because of a little water." And without any warning, she hopped into the river and rather smoothly made her way across. The water only went up to her knees anyway. Both Jack and Jacob gaped at each other and watching Emma pull herself out of the river and shaking her legs like a wet dog. "Want to go first?" Jacob asked without looking at Jack. Yeah, okay," said Jack, now slowly making his way into knee-deep water. It was rather cold, he thought, and that it was nice with the sun still shining on his face. The current beat at his legs, trying its best to carry him away with it. But, like Emma, Jack was able to push through with Emma's help. He hoisted himself onto the dry bank. And with those 2 on the other side, Jacob reluctantly put his feet into the water and bolted across the water. "You seemed a bit hesitant there," said Emma, trying not to make her smile look so obvious. "What do you mean, hesitant?" he asked, pouring the water out from his boots. "We can go that way. It's not so deep down there. Want to go first?" said Emma, imitating Jacob's low voice. "Did I really say all of that?" he asked, trying to sound casual and failing miserably. "Yeah, mate," said Jack, now laughing too. "You really did." "Okay, well, if you must know," started Jacob, putting his drenched boots back on his feet, "I never learnt how to swim, so the water's always sort of made me uncomfortable. All right, there. Happy now?" There was another silence, nothing compared to the silence back inside Mrs. Thorland's house, but it was soon broken by the sound of Emma laughing hysterically, and even Jack thought it was rather humorous. "It's not funny," Jacob shouted, making the other 2 calm down slightly. No, you're right," said Emma, still chuckling to herself. "It's a very serious matter. Next time we'll have to come across water. I'll piggyback you." And Emma erupted with laughter, laying down on her bag, and continued laughing for several moments. Jack didn't start laughing, but he too was still smiling. After 5 minutes or so, Emma regained control of herself, and the next thing they knew, they were entering the forest, and what felt like to Jack was now properly starting their journey. Jack had been in the forest many times, but had only ventured in to collect firewood, which only required him to go in so far. Not before too long did the trees begin to thicken, and the clear blue sky became more like an overcast grey sky. It was amazing how fast the temperature dropped, and the 3 of them started to get quite cold. "You had to jump in the river, didn't you?" asked Jacob, with his teeth chattering away. "I'm freezing over here." "Oh my God," sighed Emma, slightly shivering as well. "Will you get over it?" "Well, I'm sorry," Jacob started. "Unlike you, I'm not used to walking around with my clothes 5 times heavier than they should be, and I'm also not used to walking around soaked to the skin either." As he said the last few words, he snapped a branch in 2 underneath his foot. "Seriously," asked Emma, "it's just your legs that are wet." Jacob didn't say anything. Jack couldn't help but think that with Jacob and Emma constantly bickering at one another, this journey might not be all that fun. So we thought of a way to get them talking to each other in a friendly way. "Hey guys," he began, "since we're all pretty wet right now, why don't we stop for a bit and light a fire to dry ourselves and keep warm? Maybe any of us some lunch too? I'm getting hungry again." Before Emma had a chance to even think of the idea, Jacob threw his bag onto the ground and began chopping at the nearest and smallest tree he could see. "That's if the matches weren't saturated in the river. Then yeah, sure," said Emma in a very sarcastic tone. When Jacob heard what she had said, his eyes widened as though the world around him was ending. No, they're fine," said Jack, pulling them out of the top of his small backpack. "I've got them here, and they seem pretty dry to me." Moments later, Jacob had collected all the pieces of wood and bark that he had cut up and made a decent-sized pile. Jack lit the match and threw it onto the heap of logs. Instant heat, warmth flooded the surrounding areas, and Jack's nostrils were reminded of bonfire night. It felt wonderful. The three of them all fell to the floor and huddled around the fire, throwing more bits of log every now and then to keep it going and to make it slightly bigger. Jacob opened his bag and pulled out some cold turkey sandwiches his mother had prepared for them before they left. Silence filled the air, and all that could be heard was the sound of the broken trees crackling away in the fire and the chewing of sandwiches coming from Jack, Emma, and Jacob. After they had eaten all the sandwiches they could for the time being, Jack thought they ought to carry on through the forest before it became pitch black. He did not want to think about what creatures must occupy the forest once the sun goes down. But then at the same time, he did not want to leave the comfort and warmth that was filling his body from the fire. None of the others seemed too eager to carry on just yet, so for now, he kept the idea to himself. "You said you were in this forest for nearly 3 days when you came through the other day, right, Emma?" asked Jack, looking all around him. "Yeah, I think so," she said too, looking around the forest just as Jack was. "I thought I was going insane by the end of it, and thought I'd never find any way out." "How did you find your way?" asked Jacob suddenly, sounding interested in the story. "To be honest," she began in a whisper, almost as though she was afraid of being overheard, "I'm not entirely sure. I remember walking around, and I was beginning to accept that I was going to be in here forever, and then the sudden desire to get out came over me. Next thing I know, I'm picking up my bag, and I'm running in one direction, and soon enough, I was out in the open. I couldn't believe it. I was on grass again. And then I saw that hill that I met you on, Jack, and went up there to kind of think about what had just happened." There was yet another silence in the air. Jack was pretty sure they were all thinking the same thing, and before Jack could break the silence, Jacob spoke aloud. "Do you think it was the forest itself that made you start running?" He too spoke in a hushed whisper. "Well, see, that's what I thought," said Emma, sounding a little more relaxed now that someone else was sharing her wild thoughts. "But I kept trying to think of how it could have happened. Are forests known to have mystical powers like that?" "Well, not all of them, no," said Jacob. "But I've heard stories of tales of forests that have like enchanted lakes and things in the heart of them which make the forest itself enchanted too." "Oh, wow, really?" asked Emma, sounding fascinated in this news. "Well, I didn't see anything mystical on my way through. But then again, this forest is pretty big, so I could have easily missed it." "There wasn't anything written on the maps, was there?" asked Jack finally, bringing himself into the conversation. "Saying that it was magical in any way, did it?" "If there was," said Jacob, "I don't remember seeing it." Emma pulled out the rough drawings she had done back at Jacob's house and began to examine it. "Yeah, I don't remember seeing anything on there either," she said with her nose practically touching the piece of paper. "And if there was anything on it, I would have written it here. But there's nothing." She folded up the map and put it back in her pocket. "That's weird then," said Jack, readjusting his position on the earth. "Maybe it was just you being the heroic warrior you are and just knowing." Emma started to laugh. "Thanks, Jack, but I really don't think it was me." "You don't have any wizards in your family, do you?" asked Jacob, looking seriously at Emma. She looked back at Jacob with a look that showed she had never thought of this idea. She brushed it off by forcing a laugh. "What? A wizard? Wizard heritage? Of course not." She threw another log onto the fire. It was getting steadily darker now. "That's ridiculous." "Well, you never know," said Jacob, sitting and looking straight into Emma's eyes. "Where do your parents come from?" There was a pause, as Emma bit her lip and looked into the fire. Doesn't matter, she said. I just know that the chance of them being wizards is impossible. How do you know, though? Shouted Jacob, and Jack could tell that he might be going over the line there. How very right he was. Because if they were wizards at all, they would probably still be alive. Jacob crunched his eyes and hung his head. He realized immediately that he had gone too far. Sorry, he said quietly, opening his eyes again. Never mind, guys. It happened, and that's that. Jack couldn't help himself. How did it happen? Amazingly, Emma didn't explode at the question. Instead, she stared into a fire and answered calmly. There was a great battle a while ago, when I was really small. I have no idea what they were fighting for, but whatever it was, it claimed my mum and dad. Both Jack and Jacob had the same expression of shock on their faces. What? Said Emma. Don't you believe me? It's not that, said Jacob, but I'm pretty sure that what you're talking about is the Great Battle of Silverville, about 10 years ago. He too put another log onto the fire. What makes you say that? Asked Emma. Because that same battle took my father. They were fighting against someone terrible. I can't remember the name, but, killed someone because they didn't make his hot meal or something. That's what my mum says anyway. She doesn't talk about it too much. Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. This Battle of Silverville must be the same one in which he lost his mother. Everyone else was opening up. He thought he ought to as well. I lost my mum in that fight too, he said quietly. My dad was supposed to go, but when the people came to sign him up, Dad was sick and was in no shape to fight. They were going to put him up at the front since he looked like he would die from his illness. They thought if they put him out there, he'll only die anyway, so what's the point? Jack paused for a bit before speaking again. It was the first time he had ever spoken about this to anyone. They were going to take him until Mum stepped in and made sure they signed her up instead of Dad. It took a while for her to convince him, but in the end it worked. Dad said she was the only woman in the entire army. Oh, Jack, said Emma, putting her hand on his shoulder, to which made Jack smile, but was able to conceal it in the firelight. That's seriously something to be proud of, she continued. The only woman Conrad among 10,000 men. They won, though, didn't they? Said Jacob, looking at Jack for the answer for once. Yeah, Dad tells me they won the fight, but not the war. But he never elaborates on that. What do you think he means by it? Asked Jack, turning between Jacob and Emma. Well, normally, began Jacob, when someone says something like that, it means the dispute between the people fighting isn't over. Like another battle between them could erupt out of nowhere. Well, that's comforting, said Jack, sorry. What were they fighting against, though? Asked Emma. Were they fighting against just people, or were there creatures involved too? I'm pretty sure Dad said it was a mix of both, said Jack. On our side, we had just people. They had swords, shields, axes, bow and arrows. I even think some of them had maces. But on the other side, they had the same as we did, plus all sorts of creatures such as wolves, trolls. I even think Dad said something about a dragon. A dragon? Asked Emma. How on earth did they win that fight? I don't know, said Jack, but apparently they did. Imagine fighting a dragon, said Jacob quietly in a tone of fear, but also with awe. I hope I never do, said Jack honestly. There was more silence, only with the sound of the fire still crackling away at the wood, until suddenly the ground started to rumble beneath Jack's feet. Do you feel that? He asked quietly to the other two, who nodded but didn't speak. The rumbling became louder and louder until what was making the sound came running towards Jack, Emma, and Jacob. Emma screamed, and Jacob reached for his axe. It stopped dead in front of them. Jack's mouth fell open, and his eyes widened again. He had never seen anything like it.